The information in this podcast is provided for informational purposes only. You should not use any information discussed in this podcast and related materials to make medical or healthcare related decisions. Always consult your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with regards to diagnosing and managing your medical condition. Any medications or treatments, including any discussed in this podcast, should be initiated and managed by a qualified healthcare professional. Welcome to Long COVID The Answers. This is our third podcast special of 2026 for our Long COVID The Answers podcast series, recorded on Thursday, the 23rd of July, 2026. My name is Dr. Funmi Okunola, and I will be interviewing two highly respected professors of physiology in the long COVID world. And having met them personally, I must say two very friendly, incredibly decent individuals who are humble considering all of their achievements. We will be exploring some of their research projects pertaining to long COVID and talk about the International Society for Long COVID and Post-Acute Infection Syndromes, or ISLC-PAS, of which they are both leading members, and the important conference that will be held by this organisation in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, in August of this year. Let me start by introducing Professor Rob Wüst. Professor Wüst is an Associate Professor of Muscle Physiology in the Department of Human Movement Sciences at the VU University in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He is also Chair of the Scientific Programme Committee and Chair of the Organising Committee of the ISLC PAS conference this year. With regards to Professor Wüst's educational attainments and career, he obtained a double doctorate in muscle physiology in 2009 from the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK and the VU University in Amsterdam, studying why smokers are more prone to muscle fatigue. From 2009 to 2012, his postdoctoral work was conducted at Leeds University in the UK, where he studied the control of mitochondrial respiration during exercise. And on returning to the Netherlands, he continued research related to cardiac metabolism and mitochondrial function. Professor Wüst has over 20 years of experience in exercise and cardiovascular science, including expertise in oxygen consumption, mitochondrial performance, and cardiac and skeletal muscle function. He is currently involved in a large study pertaining to understanding fatigue in patients with long COVID and ME/CFS. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
Introducing Professor Mark Faghy. Professor Faghy is a professor of clinical science physiology at the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at the Loughborough University in the UK. He is also a leading member of the Scientific Committee, International Abstract Committee, and Organising Committee of the ISLC PAS conference this year. Professor Faghy obtained a first-class honours BSc in Sports and Exercise Science at the University of Derby, where he also completed a PhD in exercise physiology. For his PhD, he won the 2016 BASIS Professor Tom Riley Doctoral Dissertation of the Year Award. Professor Faghy's postdoc work continued at Derby University, where he began as a senior lecturer, progressing to a Professor of Clinical Exercise Science over a 10-year time span. He's been working on long COVID research since 2020, and in 2024, his group's research program, Profiling the Determinants of Long COVID, received the Nature Inclusive Health Research Award, reflecting commitments to evidence-based, patient-centered practice. Professor Faghy also led the world's first IV antiviral trial using remdesivir for people with long COVID. His current work at Loughborough University explores the mechanisms, pathophysiology, and impact of living with long COVID, aiming to understand its causes and improve outcomes for those affected. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Funmi. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Rob and Mark, do either of you have any conflicts of interest to declare?
No, I don't have any conflict. No.
Good. Okay. So I'm going to ask each of you a series of questions about some of the seminal research you've done, how you came to work together, and why the ISLC PAS conference is so important. I would love to have the time to do a deep dive into a lot of the work that both of you have done, and we will probably do that in the future, but our time is limited, so I will concentrate on 2 papers and an approach to research before we move on to discuss the conference. If we turn to Rob first, a lot of your research involves study of our mitochondria. Could you give a brief explanation for our non-scientific audience about what they are and their function in our bodies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So let me begin with explaining what mitochondria are. They typically are explained as the powerhouse of the cell. That's the very standard term for mitochondria. What they actually do is they provide energy for all our cells in the body. They produce the ATP, so the currency for energy that is needed for work in the body, perform work in the body, to make your muscles move, to make your brain function well, to make your heart beat, to do essentially every aspect of your body. And as a result, mitochondria are really important for energy production. We also now know that mitochondria are not solely the powerhouses of the cell, but they can also involve in different aspects of cell function, such as related to signaling pathways and antioxidants, for instance. So we know that there is a lot of additional factors that mitochondria do besides producing the energy required for all our activities in daily life.
Thank you for that. Could you give a brief explanation of post-exertional malaise?
Yeah, so explaining post-exertional malaise, we have to go to standard physiology first. So when it comes to mitochondria, they get better and they produce more and more energy when we train better. So when we train, when we go outside, and healthy people, training our mitochondria makes them stronger and makes them less fatigable. Now, what happens in people with post-acute infectious syndromes, such as long COVID or ME/CFS, we know there's something wrong with the adaptation to exercise. So typically exercise is good for us. However, in patients with post-acute infectious syndromes, such as long COVID or ME/CFS, they don't have the same adaptation. So there's something happening in the body that essentially turns worse when we exercise. So the adaptation to exercise is maladaptive, essentially, and people feel more fatigued, feel drained in energy. Other symptoms can worsen and new symptoms can develop as well. And that means that people are not going to recover easily from exercise above a certain intensity. So that's really something that is maladaptive, essentially. Exercise above a certain threshold.
And it's not just exercise, is it? It can be an emotional
Exactly, yeah.
And people that suffer from this are just completely wiped out, aren't they?
Exactly. So we know that there's a certain threshold above this post-exertional malaise can develop. It doesn't have to be physical exercise, but also exertion from mental or cognitive exercise. They can initiate this exertional malaise. But we know the threshold can be different from different people. Also, the triggers can be different. Some people have more physical complaints rather than mental complaints, and others have more they develop post-exertional malaise after cognitive exertion quicker than physical exertion. So there's a lot of differences in flavors, essentially, of post-exertional malaise. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting. The paper that you're most well known for, and for me was one of the most validating pieces of science for people living with long COVID and ME/CFS, was Muscle Abnormalities Worsen After Post-Exertional Malaise in Long COVID, published in Nature Communications in January 2024. Please give a brief explanation of who you studied and what you did.
Yeah, so we have to go back 2 years before the paper was published in 2022. That's when we thought, there's something strange with the patients that we see in the hospital. So a patient called me and said, we see these patients, they complain about muscle problems, fatigue problems, and I'm pretty sure there's nothing to do with their brain function or psychological factors. So we think there's really something going on inside the skeletal muscles. Can we study this together? So then we started doing this very systematically, essentially, starting with 2 master students. And what we did is we particularly patients that were visiting the long COVID clinic at a hospital in Amsterdam that also suffered from physical post-exertional malaise. So post-exertional malaise from a physical cause. And that means that we are identifying or limiting to a small group of patients that have this post-exertional malaise. We also didn't pick the worst patients, essentially. We picked mild, moderate patients, particularly mild patients who were able to come to the hospital and could actually cycle. We put them on a bike. We asked them to cycle until their maximal voluntary exertion, and we know that would induce some PEM, essentially. We asked them to come back the next day, and we took a muscle biopsy from these patients. We also took a muscle biopsy before the test, so that we would have before and after biopsy from every participant. And we did it for 25 patients and 25 patients controls that were recovered from our COVID infections. The control group was also COVID infected, but recovered properly. And then we studied essentially what happens in the skeletal muscle in these patients.
Okay, great. How did you get patients? I've had conversations with colleagues about this. How did you get patients to agree to a quadriceps or thigh muscle biopsy? Wasn't that painful?
Yeah, we get that question a lot. And actually, it was super easy. Participants were just essentially waiting, and they really wanted to participate because they knew there was something wrong inside the body, and they really wanted to help us understanding what happens inside the body. This new disease where hardly anyone knew anything about. So it was relatively easy to get participants. And I think in 2 weeks' time, we had 25 people signed up.
Wow.
Now, what we did is, of course, the biopsy is an invasive procedure. Under local anesthesia, we took, using a needle, a piece of muscle the size of 1 grain of rice, so super small. And with that amount of tissue, we've been able to perform all these experiments, and we're still actually performing experiments on these grains of rice as we speak. So it was very easy to get the participants, and it was not painful at all.
So you only needed to do this once, and it was a bit like having, I guess, a blood sample taken or a vaccination, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So the actual procedure we did 2 times. So before the bike test and also one after the bike test, so that we can compare before-after differences. The procedure took less than 5 seconds.
Okay, that's great and reassuring. I'd like to briefly explore some of the seminal findings of this paper. There were specific changes in the mitochondria and skeletal muscle cells of long COVID patients that were exercised. Could you please explain what they were, bearing in mind that we also have a non-medical and non-scientific audience?
Yeah, so when we looked inside the skeletal muscle, we first, of course, wanted to understand more about these mitochondria, these energy-producing organelles inside the body, inside the skeletal muscle. Is there something wrong with them? And that's indeed what we found, is they don't perform as well as healthy control participants would do. So that was interesting finding that we knew there are signs that could help us explain why people feel more fatigued all the time, because their skeletal muscles, mitochondria, are not working as well as healthy controls. That was one thing. The other thing is more of or less the color of the skeletal muscle. So when you have red tissue, red muscles, they are very well adapted to endurance exercise. So you can compare it to, for instance, the meat of a duck versus a chicken. A duck breast is dark, rich in mitochondria, and rich in fiber types that can do prolonged exercise. Chickens cannot fly compared to ducks, and chicken meat is very white. They don't have so many mitochondria, and also the fiber type is more white. And that's exactly what we also found in patients. Their muscles were more whiter compared to the healthy controls. So that means that also from that perspective, we could say, okay, something strange happening in patients that could explain maybe their higher fatigability. One important aspect of these things is that particularly the color of the skeletal muscle doesn't change from one day to the next. So that does not explain to us why you get post-exertional malaise. What we did find, however, was that the mitochondria, the function of the mitochondria, became worse after 1 day of the maximum exercise test. So when we think that there is something happening inside the skeletal muscle that makes the mitochondria the function worse 1 day after a maximal bout of exercise, where we induced post-exertional malaise. We tried to figure out why that is, but that's something that is really for the next studies.
Okay, that's an excellent explanation. I've read the paper several times and never looked on it like that. Why were your findings important, Rob?
And that's actually something that surprised me too. When we worked on this for 2 years, for me, when the paper was finally out, for me, it was old news already because we worked on it for so long. But we realized that once the paper got out, people were certainly saying, hey, there's really something going on inside the skeletal muscle that can explain why we feel so fatigued and why we feel so tired all the time. And maybe also contribute to the understanding of post-exertional malaise. So one of the reasons that how we like to see it is that before 2024, there was a big group of people that thought that it's a psychological issue that these patients had. and there's just something happening in the brain. They are more depressed or have a burnout, and you could just go to the physiotherapist, do some exercise, and you may get better. But around the time, things were changing already, because the physiotherapist kept telling us, yeah, we noticed that patients are not recovering from physiotherapy. Patients tell us, like, this is really not something that's in our brains, it's really in our body. And I think this helped us, that patients received some recognition, essentially, that there's really something that's in the body changing that can explain their symptoms. And I think 2 years later, more and more people start to recognize, based on the work from a lot of people from 2024, or maybe a little bit earlier, up to today.
Right, thank you. I've been watching and listening to Dr. David Kaufman and Dr. Eileen Ruhoy's series. I know Dr. Eileen Ruhoy is, I found out incidentally recently, she's a member of ISL CPAS. They have a podcast called Unraveled, and their clinical experience and research around the use of rapamycin I've been listening to intently. And in that, they postulate that some of the proposed pathophysiological changes in long COVID and complex chronic disease patients are signs of premature aging, hence the use of rapamycin, such as mitochondrial exhaustion, deposition of amyloid, immune dysfunction. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a very interesting proposition, this accelerated aging phenotype. This is something that I've also been working together with a group from South Africa, Dr. Pretorius, Professor Pretorius. The thing is a little bit that the accelerated aging phenotype is an interesting way to look at it, but I cannot imagine that it's solely an accelerated aging phenotype only, because people are not just getting older. There's really something else going on as well. It may have aspects of accelerated aging, but I don't think it is exactly the same, because otherwise it would be, how do I say, you wouldn't see the same type of symptoms, for instance. So symptoms like POTS or orthostatic intolerance are not the typical symptoms that you see with aging. So there are aspects of the disease that are really not related to an accelerated aging phenotype. But in terms of cell adaptations, that maybe there is an aspect of that indeed, yeah.
Yeah, I think so, because listening to their podcasts and rereading your paper, to me, there seemed to be some form of similarity in the changes. I found it an interesting concept at the cellular level. Obviously, and also working with an older adult age group at the moment. And one of the features is that they lose their sense of balance. Their autonomic nervous system ages, and it's one of the reasons why the elder people are more prone to falls. So there just seems to be an echo of similarities there that I think is worth pursuing in studies, and I just wanted to pose that question to you.
But have to realize too that also children get long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome and ME/CFS. So it's not just simply an accelerated aging phenotype, because the children get it. And that means that even in developing body, you can get this type of disease. So that it's an interesting concept to think about, and it helps us maybe also finding possible treatment options, but it's not going to be the magic bullet that solves the disease.
And I'm thinking more in terms of a cellular level. I mean, children contract long COVID. There could be similar mitochondrial changes. But anyway, that was excellent, Rob. Mark, thanks for your patience. With you, I'd like to look and examine the methodology and philosophy around conducting research with the scientific group that you lead, as I believe your whole approach is truly excellent and really needs to be emulated widely. Frankly, I only recently came to understand that sometimes scientific research with participants can be unintentionally harmful because it often isn't patient-centered. So, as I stated in my introduction, you are the lead academic in an international and interdisciplinary research team that won the prestigious 2024 Nature Inclusive Health Research Award for your program entitled Profiling the Determinants of Long COVID. And to our audience, we will have links to all of these things in our show notes. Please tell us about this award and the team that won it.
Yeah, thank you. As you've already highlighted, a highly prestigious award. Nature run these award programs, recognizing research around the world and research groups around the world for different approaches, different philosophies in different areas. And the inclusive health one's really important to us, the research team, because we truly value the kind of the voice of the patients in every aspect of our research design. From early as just developing ideas and research questions, our patients are heavily involved in that process, and they come on that journey with us and often direct that journey, if I'm completely honest, around, What are we asking? Is that relevant? Is that important? Through to the design. How are we going to test that question? How are we going to ask that question? Making sure that we do that in a way that is inclusive. How do we bring in the hard to reach groups? How do we bring the more severe patients? Truly testing us in our ability to research and to research in that kind of inclusive way. So yeah, incredibly delighted to have picked that up on behalf of the team, but have to recognize that there is a very big team behind that award, and that stems from patients, researchers, all levels, from even undergraduate students we have involved in all of our projects. So our inclusive doesn't just work with patients, it brings in young scientists, experienced scientists, but one of the key philosophies, and it's impossible to name everybody individually, but one of our philosophies is that we will work with anybody who can add value. And that's, bringing in the relevant expertise that allows us to ask and answer questions in different ways. And we can't confess to being experts in all areas. So when we have a knowledge gap, we fill it. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's our philosophy.
That's a great attitude. And your group had a real international footprint, didn't it?
Literally
from all over the world.
Yeah, literally spans all four corners of the world. What that means in reality is that we have meetings at all hours of the day across the day. As Rob will testify, he's part of this team. So we have meetings very early in the morning, very late at night, sometimes in the middle of the night. But that's what we have to do to work across these boundaries. Geography shouldn't be a boundary to the work we do. We just plan our time around it.
Excellent. I read your submission for the award, and in it you stated that your philosophy is to develop research with patients and not for patients. What does that mean?
Yeah, very good question. I think historically, traditionally, maybe the first time a patient hears about a study or sees information about a study is at the point that it's gone through all of the approvals process, it's been funded, it's gone through the ethics approvals, and then researchers go out to advertise to recruit patients. And I think there's something quite fundamentally wrong with that, because the question is to benefit patients. That's what the purpose of research is for. And if a patient is seeing it after all those steps and processes have been completed, it's too late. Actually, they need to be involved in that first thing. So yeah, we develop our research with the patient. So in the entirety of going through the research question, the methodology, the kind of different approaches, all the way through to dissemination. And we do that with, and we take them on that journey together collaboratively, as opposed to designing or having an idea, designing a project, and then asking people to come and complete it because we think that's the right thing. So no, we include them in that entire process.
And now that you say it, it seems so obvious that that's what should be done.
Sure, it is, and it should be, but it isn't. And traditionally, historically, that's not always been the case. And I think you said in the intro to this part of the podcast was that sometimes it's actually quite detrimental, because it's scientists, researchers, clinicians with an idea. By the time they actually engage with the patients, that it's already well developed in their own minds about what is the right way to do things, or the methods, or the right question to ask. When actually, I think I can say this quite honestly, in long COVID, it's certainly something I stand by, is that we don't have experts in long COVID, but possibly the closest thing we have is the people living with the condition, and we should be learning from them and listening to them and bringing them in to help us answer the questions that matter.
Excellent. Why is lived experience an important part of your research?
Because, again, it goes back to that. I don't think we have experts in long COVID. We have people who are knowledgeable, but the closest thing to experts we have are the patients, and we can learn an awful lot. And it definitely shaped our early pandemic research by engaging with and listening to the stories. And for us as a team, it goes back pre-pandemic, it goes back pre-COVID research. But having conversations and listening and really paying attention to the details that patients want to share and will happily share. And Rob talked about it with the muscle biopsies. They're not to do this if they think that there's something valuable that can be learned. And it doesn't just go from giving and providing samples, but just the accounts of what patients have experienced, and how does that feature and shape our thinking about asking questions that are important to furthering the knowledge base. So it's just hugely important and should be for everyone in this space.
How has this approach impacted research design for people living with long COVID?
Yeah, so for us, it's a massive part of every component of the process. But I think the biggest impact that it's had for us is made us think differently about the journey of a patient when they first come in from the trial, and how we provide safe spaces for people to come in and do that. I think from our antiviral trial, I can share very honestly that our patient representative group helped us to develop a safety mitigation strategy to ensure that when patients came in to participate in the research, they weren't exposed to potential of reinfection, because we all know that that can have a detrimental impact on presentation and symptomology. So what could we put in place to prevent that or reduce the risk? Prevent's a difficult word. We can't guarantee that we can do it, but what can we do? So we provided tests for everybody that came in. Patients and research staff were testing regularly. Masks. We changed the air filters in the spaces that we use for the research to make sure that they were HEPA grade as opposed to the standard ventilation systems. We had different access routes to get to the clinic spaces, so they didn't have to walk through the main entrance to a hospital space, which can be incredibly busy. And for some people, that might be quite a scary thing to do, I guess. We've been poorly for so long. So yeah, they made us rethink everything, and rightly so. And it's a really good example of how that's impacted and allowed our studies to recruit really, really well. I don't want to say it because I don't want to jinx it, but we don't have to work hard to recruit to studies because patients, we put their well-being at the centre of our approaches.
What a fantastic holistic approach. I mean, when I went to medical school, one of the things that was drummed into us was do no harm. And I think somehow along the way that's been forgotten. And your approach is reintroducing that philosophy. Thank you so much for that. I find that the majority of research that I read with regards to long COVID involves white middle class women residing in high income countries, with a real lack of focused research involving people of colour, LGBTQ, Indigenous groups, or people from lower middle income countries. What experience do you have with regards to being more inclusive of these groups of people?
Yeah, I think the things that you highlight in the question for me are really important. And I think that's characteristic of clinical research, not just in long COVID and post-acute infection syndromes research, but clinically across the board, we have that skewed kind of demographic. And what we've tried to do to try and address that, and have we got it 100% right? No, I don't think we have. I think we've made steps and we've made progress, and I'll come to that in a moment, but we could still do better, and we're still learning and trying to be able to do that. I think everybody sets out with very good intentions about generating representation within their research. I think I've been part of many conversations where that's a conversation that's had very early, but there are some systemic challenges with how we engage those communities. But for us, that starts with building confidence and relationships. So not necessarily going with an app, but going with information, presenting information about this is what we found or what we're hoping to do. Building that rapport, building those relationships, maybe with trusted community groups or community organizations. Even found that the media has helped us do that when we've engaged with the community via the media, that we see an uptake or an increase in the interest for engaging with research. But I'm challenging our group to do more and to do better with that, because I still think we could do better. And for example, on one of our future upcoming trials, we have a patient representative who pre-long COVID was working in a clinical trust, and their job was to build community relationships and increase representation through EDI principles. So we brought that person into the trial to help build a strategy to make sure that we have EDI representation across the board in the trials that we've got coming on. So that's 6 years, maybe more, maybe probably closer to 10 years worth of work have gone into that. And it shows that, yes, we've made progress, but we're probably not where I think we ought to be able to do that. So it's still ongoing.
Okay. And what does EDI stand for?
Oh, sorry, equality, diversity, and inclusion.
Okay, yeah, because here it's like DEI. So thank you for that answer. Could you please give the audience some examples of published research or events that have emerged from profiling the determinants of long COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll extend it way beyond the academic articles, because they are written for academic audiences, read by a very small percentage of the population. So yeah, again, but within those academic articles, we've got the data-driven changes in patient-reported outcomes, demonstrating the prolonged impairment, because this study was really about learning about patients as they discharge from hospital or living in the community setting, what happens over a period of time. And that was really important for us to develop the mechanistic research. But we coupled that using validated clinical outcomes with the lived experience. What does it mean in reality? What does that reduction in functional status, reduction in quality of life, or huge burden of fatigue, what does it mean? And that's where we ground ourselves in the reality to make sure that we're answering and asking the questions that are relevant. But what was really important for us on the back of that was we were able to try and communicate that out more widely. And we did a series of workshops and webinars around presenting that information out. But probably the most novel and innovative project that we did on the back of that to disseminate the findings was collaborating with a group of artists from the University of Derby, but we were working at the time, And what they did was actually took the clinical scientific data and tried to present it in a way that was more accessible to a wider community. And we kind of termed that project Shedding Light on Long COVID, because it made use of a community entity called The Shed, which was a vehicle for taking scientific information out of university into the community. So we held a 2-day conference in Derby. We had this exhibition within the Museum of Making in Derby over a 6-week period, where the public could engage with research and learn about long COVID. And that was really about raising awareness, because this was in 2024. So taking the message that, COVID-19 and long COVID is a very pertinent issues that we need to be aware of. And I can't remember the number of interactions, but it was definitely in the tens of thousands of people engaged with that exhibition. And it was all underpinned by science, but communicated in a very, very different way. And I have to pay homage to the artists that were involved in that, because they provided some amazing exhibitions that people could engage with.
That's fantastic. I think you've partly answered this. How does your approach to research deliver real-world impacts?
Yeah, I think the shortest answer to that is that we're asking questions that matter. We're asking questions that are really relevant to the patients. So grounding our research in the lived experience, make sure that when we put these findings out and when we're talking about the findings, we're asking questions that are relevant and that people can relate to. And we do a lot of work to try and make sure that we engage with the community via non-academic, traditional academic papers and methodologies, which I'm glad that we've already talked about it previously. That's getting more and more common, and that's just so important. But I think to bring it back very shortly to the question that you asked, it's about answering questions that are important. And if we are doing that naturally, it's going to have an impact, because it will inform the knowledge, the awareness, the understanding, or potentially, as we are now, moving into trialing different treatments. And I think if we can do that, and research matters, research will always have impact.
Great. In your opinion, how can your patient-led approach to research be disseminated across the wider scientific community?
Oh, great question. I don't know if I know the answer to that one, Funmi. We don't hold secrets around how we research. We tell everybody that we slightly do it in a different approach. And if anybody has ideas and examples of how we can move that forward to becoming normal, if that's a normal approach to research, then yeah, we'd be very happy to do it. But I think ultimately, if we see the journey that we've been on and the things that we've achieved as a group, I have to bring that back to, we wouldn't have done that had we not engage the patients in the way that we do. So yeah, I'll throw it back out to the community. If people have got ideas about how we can make that normal practice, engaging with research funders, policy members, I'm more than happy to just kind of take that challenge and make sure that this becomes normal.
Well, we're part of trying to broadcast it. That's one of the whole points of this podcast. So we're gonna help you with that. Okay, so thank you. We at Long COVID The Answers would just like to give a big thanks to both of you for the pioneering work that you're doing with regards to long COVID and other complex chronic diseases, and for your commitment to collaborative, inclusive scientific research. Thank you again for helping to set up the International Society for Long COVID and Post-Acute Infection Syndromes, and the very important conference that you are hosting in Amsterdam that will bring together clinicians, scientists, and people with lived experience so as to accelerate the path towards treatments and or a cure for these debilitating diseases.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to the audience out there, thank you for listening and watching. Please rate, review, and subscribe to us on whatever platform you use, as this really helps our organisation. Until next time, bye for now.